Today is the topic I'm presenting is a little different than what I normally present. It's heavily in food microbiology, you could say, but it's a topic that is affecting us all very much, and in particular in my profession as food scientist, it's creating wreak havoc in the industry, and I'm sure in many of your own professions. It's something we're going through in this generation. So it's a really interesting times that we're living. So in this session, I'm going to be focusing relating food security and the impact of what's happening in consumer preferences that may have actually indirectly affect food security because it may be having an impact on food safety and on food quality. So, for starters, you all have seen this figure. We are all stressed as a species by this challenge that we're confronting. The fact that we need to figure how we're going to feed all these people in about 30, 35 years from now. So that's something that, as you know, is this challenge or this daunting task is faced by the fact that there are many different factors that may come into the play of whether we're able to feed that many people and by the 2015. So many of those issues that we're trying to tackle are the fact that we're living under climate change, and we don't really know what's going to happen in 20 years from now. There are all sorts of predictions. We know that we produce a lot of food. For the most part, a lot of the human population is fed, but we do know that we waste a lot of it. We're facing potential crisis with the water shortage, the amount of land that we could use for producing crops, and at the same time, the human population is facing a global epidemic of obesity. And on top of that, we are seeing demographic trends for different reasons, for political, for humanitarian crisis, and we are also seeing some consumption trends. And those are the ones I'm going to be focusing mostly. But before I move on any further, just wanted to share with you a few graphs taken from data from the United Nations and also from the European Union. And something that I don't think is anything new to you. I guess the main message from this graph is food waste is something that we are living. We as society, we haven't figured out how to reduce food waste. It's one of the most pressing problems if we're ever going to figure out how to feed that many people. But one thing that I want you to compare is on the left side, you will see the developed countries, on the right side, the less developed countries. And one message is the more that the developing countries transition to developed, the more waste is going to be generated, will tend to be generated, because if you look at the red part of the bars, that's going to be at the consumer stage. Now, at the same time, one of the changes that I'm putting a stress on this and a major task is the fact that we're seeing shifts in economic condition of many of those countries, and these are the predictions based on existing data on how the middle class is going to be moving in different regions of the world. And the most important of them is the one right in the middle with Asia, that the middle class in Asia is predicted to be expanded rapidly, and this is just by 2030, is being contributing to the largest portion of middle class in the entire globe. So, and this trend is actually being followed by the fact that middle class people normally are going to be eating more animal foods. And we're already seeing the fact that in both these cases, either with milk on the left side, the consumption of milk on the left side, and the consumption of poultry and beef, the developing countries, this is total consumption, this is not per capita, but the total consumption is already much higher in reaching levels much higher in developing countries than in non-developed, and this is just the date till 2011. So, at the same time, and we're not going to have time to cover all of those different aspects, but the main point I want to make in this conversation is we're seeing some important trends from consumers. And I call this, there is this antagonism that we're actually currently sensing from a large portion of consumers in developed countries mostly about what I call here technological foods. And what I'm going to define as technological foods are actually being produced based on advances in science and technology that have taken place for many, many decades until now. But it turns out that now we've been questioning whether those advances in technology and science that we have been coming up for years are actually the right thing or not. So, and this is basically creating a lot of stress on the entire industry, and because it's driving a lot of the consumer preferences. The food industry, that's the one I'm closely related, the processing industry, is very, very stressed about the fact they're trying to chase those consumer demands to meet their expectations. And what I'm talking about here is, on the left, you typically see those terms that are associated with things that are bad in our food. Probably the worst of them is processed food. If you Google processed foods, you will find tons of websites that the first thing, anybody that is recommending what's the right thing to eat, they're going to tell you, avoid processed foods. And from there you have conventional, large farms, GMOs, irradiation, and all of those names that you're very familiar to. And that's what the consumer is shying away. On the left, on your right side, you're going to find all those good names that the consumer is looking for. The organic, the local, sustainable, grass-fed, etc. And especially for this conference, probably is very relevant, things like grass-fed and cage-free and those claims that the consumer is actually very interested in buying. For organic foods, it's probably among this natural foods category, the organic foods is probably the better studied, the most mature kind of the categories, because there is data, because organic foods are among all of those categories are the ones being regulated very closely, and it's a distinct category. So we have data that the fact that, the consumption has been going up and the demand for those has been going up, and this is just data from the U.S. And in other parts of the world, the organic market is a lot more mature than what it is in this country. So, what is it basically? What is behind those demands from the consumer? Well, it's listed in this slide: health concerns, environmental, social, ethical. For example, the fact that the example of cage-free production systems are mostly, many people think, is basically based on ethical concerns more actually than any other reason. For this talk, we're going to be concentrating mostly on the health concerns, but before I move any further, just wanted to make sure everyone is on the same page when I'm talking about the different terms security. And I know that if you put the biosecurity on altogether, it's actually a different term than the term food security as I'm using here. So for everyone to be on the same page, we're going to be addressing food security as the concept when everyone has access or there's sufficient access to food supply. And then within the food security, there are two important components that are really essential for that food security to exist, which is one of them is food safety, and the other one is food defense. So I want to take this small parenthesis just to make sure that everyone is on the same page and define the way we risk assessors define hazard and risk. Hazard is any agent that has the potential to cause adverse health effects. A risk is the probability of the hazard and the magnitude of the hazard. There are two types of risk in general. We have risks that cause acute health effects. Those are the foodborne poisoning, cause symptoms like vomiting or diarrhea. And then we have the chronic risks. Those are going to be much longer term. It may involve consumption over a long period of time. If you take all of the different reasons all of the different diseases that make people sick when they consume contaminated food products, you could put it in any place in this diagram on this slide. and I'm highlighting in green, those are probably I'm going to be referring, or those are more likely that the consumer is going to be more interested in them, especially in the category of chemical poisoning, because that's an area that you could put a lot of the concerns of the consumer on chemical poisoning. And the red ones are the ones that typically the public health officials are going to be much more worried about. Now, following with a little bit of the fundamental terms, what is a safe food? That's an important concept. And the reason why I'm going to kind of cover the definitions that from the expert or scientific point of view are the most widely accepted is because in the consumer's mind, their definition of safety is somewhat different to what public health experts may have. Now, what time should I stop, by the way? Because you said 2:30. And that one, 2:50. Okay, good. That's the one is in the program. Just want to make sure because I got it right. Anyway, so and one of the uncertain things when it comes down to what exactly is a safe food or not safe food is how do we determine that something is acceptable or not? And we determine by doing different things. In the ideal world, and this is the way where we're trying to the kind of government we have is they're trying to use science, scientific evidence to decide whether something is acceptable or not acceptable. And also the other question is what is the level of acceptability? What is the level, for example, of a pesticide residue in your crops? Is that the right level or not? And that's where sometimes there is a lot of difference between what the science can tell us and what the consumer can perceive about the risk. So that's a big discrepancy. And the other question that the consumer is asking constantly is who is actually defining what is acceptable level of risk. For the most part, industry is the one that sets the level of risk in a day-to-day basis. The government sets some of the rules periodically, but the industry is the one that basically releases the batch of product to the market after testing it, and they're realizing that the product is okay. And what's the role of the consumers? That's when they feel that they are not really main players in all this thing, and the consumer often feels that they are only the receivers of someone else's decision, and they need to be more on the driving seat instead of just the industry and government. All right. So let's go back to this health concerns. That's where we're going to be focusing the rest of today's conversation. Now, from the consumer perspective, this is what they think about when they talk about food safety. The consumer's mind, they're worried about chronic effects more than anything. And the other one that is more critical is unknown effects. For example, the classical example of GMOs. Well, we don't really know if we consume it for a long time what's going to happen. For the most part, all of the science has provided evidence that the bulk of the commercial GMOs that we have right now, they have very known effect. But the consumer still keeps in his mind, in her mind or his mind, well, maybe there's something we don't really know. So all of this is what's going to have the concern whether what could happen. Well, and it's going to be because of cancer, the problems we're facing with cancer. Is one of those conditions that cause a lot of dread in consumers, in the people's mind. Obesity is every time is creeping up is getting higher on people's minds. The implications of all the metabolic disorders they're having in our lifestyle. We're already seeing some figures that the life expectancy of some groups is actually coming down. Diabetes, allergies is a major concern. That's why we are getting so many allergies. Heart disease, and the category that I was telling you, what are those unknown long-term effects. So on the other hand, if you ask public health officials, what we're going to show you is in terms of foodborne disease, we're going to show you the number of people who got sick because of an outbreak of Salmonella, E. coli 157, Listeria, etc., toxins, and maybe antibiotic resistant definitely is one of those categories that a good number of experts would agree is a major concern related to food. But we realize that with those concerns from the consumer that are related to pesticides, hormones, preservatives, especially, for example, in the case of preservatives, we say, well, we've been using them for a long time, but the consumer doesn't want to eat them in their food anymore. So what's wrong with that? So there is a disconnect between the scientists and the consumer in many ways. So, and what are those factors that are influencing this disconnect between the consumer and what actually is the scientists are coming up or the experts? Well, the consumer sometimes is desperate to find solutions. And I'm sure you know somebody that has, let's say, someone, or you know somebody is suffering from one of those chronic conditions, let's say rheumatoid arthritis, that there is no good treatment for that. And I think people are looking desperately for solutions. And oftentimes they go into the internet and they find something, and it happens that all of a sudden they're believers in that treatment that has very little foundations, scientific foundations, are going to actually solve their solutions. Now, there is also, we know that these days we know a lot of all these scares that are happening, the melamine incidents with the imported food from China, all the different outbreaks that are happening every day with E. coli 157, salmonella, etc. So the consumer is hearing on the news continuously about there's something wrong in the food supply, and they're also reading about all sorts of stories. And they have developed that there is something wrong with our regulatory system that is inherently rigged, that the regulators are also part of the industry, and they're just musical chairs in between the industry regulators. So everyone is colluded. So there's this controversy. So if you read some of the websites or stories, you can find that there is some sort of conspiracy theory there. And this also gets to the point of having a major distrust of big food. That's the way it is put by many authors. And this lack of trust is also extended to all science and technology. But interestingly, we trust technology in every single of our cell phones. But when it comes down to our food, we don't really trust. The consumer is not trusting technology. So that's a different story. Now, at the same time, we live in an age that we are bombarded, and there are so many outlets of information out there in the media and the internet. So we suffer an excess of information and misinformation, and at the same time, there is something that's being created, which I call the eating right, multi-billion media industry, and I'm going to illustrate some of them in a minute. And these days, there is this, if you talk to your friends, if you're in a social gathering, and you say that you probably are going to be shying away by telling people that you went to eat at McDonald's, that's going to be seen like, shame. You didn't go to your hip local food restaurant. So it's this morality that now exists, that you have to be concerned about what you eat, and you have to be eating what is perceived as what is the right thing to eat. And also we have to call it, I guess. So oftentimes there are some science published out there that may be questionable, and also the other thing that oftentimes scientists, when they have a particular issue on a food-related toxicological level controversy, there is disagreement in the science. And also the fact that the consumer, for example, right now, this is at the core of the regulations for GMOs, is the fact that the consumer demands the right to choose, because I want to know I want to have the ability to decide why I'm eating. So that's why I don't care whether GMOs are safe or not safe. I care whether I want to be informed. I want to know. I want to have control over what I eat. And then scientists, we do sometimes a very lousy job in communicating with consumers. For example, one example of that I criticize is one of my own professional societies, the Institute of Food Technologists. You go to the website and try to find answers about processed food, which should be the society that will provide the right answers to the consumers. What's the way they define it? Well, everything is processed food. That doesn't help. You need to be better able to communicate to the consumer exactly what you're talking about. So that lack of trust, and I look at a number of a report by the Pew Research Center. They have interesting a piece of information. For example, this graph is talking about the lack of trust to establish government, industry, science, and these are just examples of how this has been evolving. For example, this graph shows how the public used to trust back in the years of Kennedy and Eisenhower, and now we're down to Obama. We're lower than, I think, close to 20%, but we were close to 80% or 70% back in those days. And it's going back and forth sometimes, but it never really recovered to the point that it used to be back in the 60s. Now, and this is another survey from the Pew Research Center, in which, if you look at just the third row, is basically that the majority of people, they don't really trust the government industry only sometimes. So they only trust only a few times, and a good percentage of them, they never trust any one of them. Now, this graph is quite telling for the topic of food trust in food. For example, if you look, the first three items is what I want you to pay attention to. This graph, again from the Pew Research Center, is the difference between the U.S. adults' opinion about different topics and the difference with scientists. This is the American Association for the Advancement of Scientists. And when it comes down to GMOs, there's a difference between 51% points of perception about whether they are safe to consume or not between scientists and the regular consumer. The use of animals in research has a difference of 42, and the safe to eat foods grown with pesticides is a difference of 40%. And then if you look at the last two, this is about evolution. The public actually move a little further to the right, and in the case of childhood vaccines, the gap is not as big. So with foods, what this is telling you, it's a little bit of an example of when it comes down to food, there is a much more of a larger disconnect between the scientist's opinion and the consumer. And where the consumer is getting their knowledge? Well, they're getting it from the social networks. The usage, the graph at the left shows the use of social networking by age, and then on the right it shows the level of usage. And this is a little old, you could say, 2012, 2014. The use of social networks is a very a never-ending, evolving situation. So they're going to be moving from a different network for the next one. But this was the one. And interestingly, if you look at who are consumers reading, and this is just at least that I got from Sylvia Borges' Toughness, on some of the top Twitter organic food bloggers that people are following. And you could see some really catching names such as Romazing and Turning the Clock Back and Food for My Family, etc. So those are the kind of information. Of course, you're familiar also with Food Babe, who's been very popular among consumers. So this is, and before I move on, and for one thing I wanted to also point out, going back to my earlier remark about the eating right multi-billion industry, is sometimes the media, all they want is just to want to have a headline. And I'm not quoting, I want to clarify, I'm not quoting Dr. Raymond here because he said that, but he said that to as an irony, and that's the way that the media is sometimes is acting. And if you just, what I'm trying to refer here is in the multi-billion-dollar eating right industry is all the different books and media and blogs that exist out there that are going to teach you how to write. People, self-proclaimed gurus, they're going to tell you all you have to do is just eat this and avoid this, and this is going to solve all your problems in the world. And some of them have really compelling stories, and you read them, and you watch their videos, and they tell you, yeah, it makes sense. People come down to make sense. For example, many of you are familiar with some of those pieces of work involved with Mike Pollan and Food Inc. and Omnivore's Dilemma, and many of those ideas are great. And I think the best contribution of some of these authors is actually having people think about what they're eating, because many consumers still don't realize to be critical about their eating. But at the same time, sometimes they portray some very simple stories that to advance their whole agenda in some ways, or the whole model of what's wrong with our food supply. And sometimes that stretches some of the truth. And I want to say it as one of the authors, if anybody remember my name back in the late 1990s, we were involved in a study at Cornell University that actually provided a simple solution to solve the problem with E. coli 157 in cattle. And I'm the first one to recognize that we actually made a mistake. And the mistake was that we extrapolated to pathogenic E. coli, our findings from non-pathogenic E. coli. And the only sad thing is that people like authors like Mike Pollan have continued to run with the story, and because it was published in Science magazine, it was almost made a dogma by him. So he's ignored the wealth of additional reports that came out of our own paper that actually didn't disprove what we said. They disproved our extrapolation, basically, that's what it is. Our findings were solid in terms of scientific findings, but the extrapolation we made, that's where what's disputed. It's been disputed very heavily. But sometimes authors like Mike Pollan, they do point out to the fact that they make this as a dogma that it's scientific truth. Yeah, so if you want to, I was trying to come up with a list of what are those, how can you summarize all of those consumer trends that we're seeing? And actually, I came across this really good special diet report from the Nutrition Business Journal, and I think they did. I think they were genius in coming up with this diagram or illustration how you can summarize all the different trends that exist these days from the consumer related to foods. You have here clean label at the left. You have plant-based. And then free from and ancient wisdom. And then very intelligently or very smart, they merged them and they created how for example, right in the middle, you cannot read it, but I encourage you to look for it on the web. Organic, gluten-free, elimination, non-GMO, raw, etc. So it was really smart to put it together like this. So this is basically what's happening right now. One of the most critical, for example, the food industry, the big, large brands of our country are struggling to deliver clean label foods. And the clean label, I guess the definition is a product that has the least number of ingredients in the label. That's in a simple way, that's the way that you want to define it. So, what does industry, our food production needs to do in order to satisfy those consumer demands? So you have to either reduce the number of ingredients, and the implications whether reducing preservatives, I'm going to comment in a little bit, could be more obvious. But for example, eliminating a lot of ingredients that I would classify as stabilizers. There are many of them that are actually intended just to use stabilizers, but I would say, just for the sake of time, stabilizing the quality of the product. And you could also use different other ingredients. Also, this trend calls for the elimination of processing steps, because the least processed, the better. The more, the fresher, the better. the reduction of the use of chemicals for sanitizing, and sometimes the adoption of questionable practices, such as encouraging the consumption of raw animal foods. So what are the consequences from my point of view as a food safety microbiologist? One of the first one I can see is we're probably going to see more an increased number of foodborne diseases resulting from eliminating ingredients or minimizing processes. And most likely we're going to see an increased food waste because the more you eliminate those preservatives, and you're going to have a faster shorter shelf life. You could have faster microbial growth. And also at the same time, we live in a society that is really, really picky about the aesthetics of the food. So I'm sure you're going to have more product is going to be rejected by the consumer because it doesn't meet their expectations regarding how the product should look like, or even or should the texture be. So, but this is creating. We can see this very negatively and just see that this is going to create a huge problem for all of us. But people are seizing the opportunity. Like in any problem, you have to always look at both sides of the picture. The danger is what I just described. Could be more foodborne disease. There could be more spoilage. But at the same time, the industries, as many companies have seized the opportunity and become some of the leaders of this trend or this opportunity to address those consumer demands. So the gluten-free is one of them. Companies just, given the fact that the Vermont the legislation for GMO in Vermont has what could not be eliminated because of the bill, the federal bill that was supposed to regulate the state regulation of GMO failed. So companies have just decided to drop the ball and say, okay, we're just going to go non-GMO, or we're just going to label it, voluntarily label it, and move on. The grass-fed has been another one that is closer to this conference, and cage-free claim. That's a number of people have become really proactively going in that direction. So either you're part of it or you're left out of it. That's basically what companies have said. We are the consumers. That's what they want. We're going to go there. And I guess the issue is in many of this is it doesn't have a lot of scientific foundation or evidence for support. This is just another example. For example, the conference for Clean Label Conference is coming up in a few weeks. So there are organizations that are already making sure that they're going to be leading the way in how they're going to solve this problem. So to end, just wanted to wrap up today's conversation with a couple of cases very rapidly. One of them is the raw milk consumption. If you don't know what's happening on public health, I just wanted you to be aware. Another one is the potential for more problems with Listeria monocytogenes. The raw milk, as you know, we've been using pasteurization for over a century, and pasteurization is proven to be very effective to control a good number of foodborne pathogens. And what is sad sometimes is that we as a society will forget that some of the pathogens we used to control were worse than the ones we have right now. Something like Coxiella burnetii, Brucella, were pathogens that are actually nastier than any of the pathogens we have right now. But on top of that, right now we're having problems with some of the other pathogens, Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli, etc. So pasteurization is regulated at the federal level, is mandated at the federal level because of the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance. And pasteurization really helped to reduce the rate of a number of infectious diseases in the U.S. earlier in the 1900s. And there is plenty of evidence that milk used to cause a lot of foodborne disease. Now it doesn't because we pasteurize it, we solved the problem. It's been one of those public health successes. But now the consumer wants to eat more, wants to drink more raw milk for many reasons. And in this country, the legislator, the consumption of raw milk is also legislated or regulated at the state level, and there's a wide diversity of different ways that states regulate. Some states do allow it, some states don't. As we've seen an increase in interest from consumers to consume raw milk, at the same time, on the epidemiological side, the outbreaks of pathogens, foodborne pathogens, is been going up. One of the graphs that I wanted to show you is the graph of number of outbreaks of Campylobacter. Campylobacter is clearly the outbreaks, the reason. Campylobacter 15 years ago was a pathogen that the number of outbreaks it caused was below 10 per year. Now we're seeing consistent numbers of outbreaks of close to 30 outbreaks per year, and more than 10 or 12 outbreaks of raw milk alone, in addition to other types of dairy foods. So that's been very, 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 very clear that there's a relationship. The other case I wanted to talk to you is the case of Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat meats, hot dogs, hams, and deli meats. As you may remember, Listeria monocytogenes was really important back in the 1990s because it caused a number of outbreaks with frankfurters, and when companies were testing for the presence of this pathogen in the product, they were able to find it relatively frequently, and meat companies used to suffer a good number more of recalls every year because of detection of this pathogen. During the decade of the early 2000s, we saw an adoption of a number of regulations that the USDA enacted, and also the industry became really proactive and supported by scientific research. They enacted a number of regulations that incorporated control in the plant, testing and environmental testing in the plant, as well as incorporation of a couple of ingredients that if you buy any kind of hot dogs or ham that don't have the natural or the organic label, they're just the regular hot dogs, you're going to find a couple of ingredients that are called, one is diacetate and the other one is lactate, so sodium salts of both of those. And those have been proven to be very instrumental to reduce the incidence of Listeria monocytogenes, in my opinion. So if we continue with this trend of eliminating ingredients into the food, probably this couple of ingredients are going to be targeted, and soon we're going to start seeing, again, incidences of more or Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat meats. Right now, Listeria monocytogenes, if you've been following the news, Listeria monocytogenes has been really, or at least more frequently found in, and related to cases of dairy foods and fresh produce. Fresh produce is becoming a really major problem in public health. So I think that's basically, I just wanted to summarize that this is what we're facing right now. And the message is, yes, we have a daunting task as a species and as a society of addressing all those needs of food security. But at the same time, the current food consumer trends are also complicating things a little more. We don't really know if what's going to be the impact in 10 years from now, whether moving to those more natural ways of producing foods are going to have we're going to be seeing more problems from the foodborne pathogen point of view, and also from the food waste consequences.